Let's review some key takeaways from this week's readings and videos related to the Beaver Wars, and then we will consider some general changes to Native American cultures in the 17th and 18th centuries. In terms of the background of the Beaver Wars, beaver pelts were highly valuable and prized by Europeans in the 16th through 18th centuries, both for fashion reasons and supply and demand reasons. They carried a tremendous value. The Dutch had allied with the Iroquois initially. The Iroquois hunted beaver with Dutch firearms. The beaver population began to fall in the Hudson River Valley, and then the first fur trade was forced northward to the St. Lawrence River. The French, meanwhile, had allied with Huron peoples, and the center of the fur trade now landed in Huron territory. The Iroquois, who had been displaced from the fur trade, at least temporarily, were threatened by control of the trade that the Huron had achieved. The English were later to enter the fur trade than their European competitors, and initially English traders individually sided with any group that would take their furs. They would later become allied with the Iroquois. In the 1640s, the Beaver Wars began with attacks by the Iroquois on Huron peoples. The Iroquois and the Susquehannock formed an alliance. Then the Iroquois warriors launched an attack in the heart of Huron territory. Key villages were destroyed, warriors were killed, and thousands were captured by the Iroquois. The Huron began to flee this territory, and they sought help from the Anishinaabeg Confederacy, or the Three Fires Confederacy. This is if you remember from the readings, the Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi. The Iroquois, meanwhile, had gained firearms from the Dutch, which made them much more powerful, at least temporarily, against their enemies. In the 1650s, the Iroquois began attacks in New France. These attacks featured scalping, slaughtering, and torture, and many residents in New France lived in fear. French leaders called on the Huron and tried to negotiate an end to the conflict, but were not successful at this time in bringing an end to the war. The 1660s marked the height of Iroquois power. The French had ordered military forces to counter Iroquois raids. There was a decrease in general in European support for the Iroquois, as evidenced by André de Prouville, who led a campaign that cut off the remaining European support for the Iroquois. In the period of 1670 to 1690, the French began the process of establishing trade posts with Tassenong, which is in present-day Indiana, to trade with Western tribes. The Iroquois destroyed it to try to retain control of the fur trade with Europeans. June of 1687, French forces captured Iroquois sachems, or chiefs. In September of that year, the Iroquois burned Iroquois villages and crops, escalating the war even further. The wars forced the migration of many native populations by the Iroquois, and the Iroquois thus claimed as their own these depopulated lands. The Huron were driven from the Hudson River Valley and Ontario westward. The Shawnee were forced out of the Ohio country. The Neutral people were chased from the northern shores of Lake Ontario and Lake Erie westward. The Erie refused to flee west, and they were nearly destroyed by the Iroquois. The Delaware were largely subjugated to the Iroquois, and the Lakota were indirectly pushed across the Mississippi River and into the Great Plains, thus changing their geographic location and eventually their culture, as we will see. The Great Peace of Montreal took place in 1701. The background of this treaty was that French attacks eventually forced the Iroquois to make peace, and the Great Peace of Montreal was signed in 1701. There were 1,300 representatives of 40 different Indian nations. To give you a sense of how comprehensive this was, the French opened hunting lands and trading posts to Iroquois in exchange for Iroquois neutrality in future Anglo-French wars. French allies were supposed to make peace with the Iroquois, which was not always the case. This brought a few decades of relative calm, but this was not a permanent peace, and it was great only in the sense perhaps of the number of peoples involved. Let's look briefly again at the Iroquois Confederacy. The Iroquois refer to themselves as the Haudenosaunee. This was also known as the Iroquois League in the Five Nations. The Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca were the original members. The Tuscarora joined in 1722, at which point the Confederacy became known as the Six Nations. The Kanawida and Hiawatha are traditionally believed to be the individuals who brought the Iroquois Confederacy together. They had a desire to stand together against invasion. The Iroquois Confederacy differed from other confederacies in being much better organized, much more consciously defined, and frankly much more effective than most other Native American confederacies. Let's next take a look at changes to native cultures in eastern North America. The French had sought to expand control of trade networks. In addition to traders and soldiers, they utilized Jesuit missionaries to both spread religion and begin to assimilate native peoples into French culture. In New England, there was great conflict that took the form of wars and overhunting. Both of these contributed to the end of the region's fur trade. As a result, Indians began to lose wars and lose power. They experienced population losses. They were reduced to scattered enclaves. These severely restricted native subsistence choices and political power, and even the practice of their traditional faiths, in some cases, was attacked by Europeans. In the Plains cultures, you had significant change as well. Native American tribes in what would become the United States and First Nation governments in what would become Canada lived on the greater interior plains, or the Great Plains. They share many cultural similarities. They were semi-sedentary. They had great reliance on the American buffalo. They practiced animist faiths. They had similar rituals like the sun dance. But they were heavily influenced by European contact. By the 1750s in the Great Plains, the horse culture of the southern interior had met with the Gun culture of the northern interior, and the result was a people, or groups of peoples who were no longer semi-sedentary and became nomadic or semi-nomadic. In the Southwest, large groups like the Pueblo Indians, the Apache, and the Navajo faced great cultural change. Spanish missionaries and troops directly influenced native cultures in the Southwest. They stole food, they stole the labor of native peoples. In some cases, they stole women. They beat, dismembered, tortured, and even executed Indians who attempted to maintain traditional religious practices. In the Southwest, Spanish-dominated indigenous nations, they issued severe punishment for resistance to colonization. Indian peoples were forced to accept European conventions and have to privately practice their own traditions. Spanish military and civilian officials chose nearby sites for presidios, which were forts, and haciendas, which were estates, to maintain control of native populations. Spanish leaders dispatched troops to indigenous villages where they captured residents, and they formed reductions, which were Spanish settlements modeled after towns in Spain. These reductions of native populations were intended to break down ethnic and kinship ties and create a more passive Indian population. Counting coup was a method of combat developed by Native Americans prior to the arrival of Europeans. It was used to humble enemies in battle without taking their lives. It's derived from the French word coup, meaning a strike or a blow. Counting coup was considered more prestigious and a more heroic act than killing an enemy. One could gain personal honor in battle, and this was the greatest achievement a warrior could attain. Coup could be counted in many ways. You could touch an enemy by hand, by knife, or with an elaborately decorated coup stick. You could lead a successful war party, steal horses in a daring manner, take weapons from an enemy in hand-to-hand combat, or save fellow warriors in battle. The image on this slide is from the 19th century. It depicts a mounted Cheyenne warrior counting coup with a lance against a dismounted Crow warrior who has a firearm. If the Cheyenne warrior survived in this example, he would gain prestige for his bravery in going up against a firearm. However, increasingly, European methods of warfare began to be adopted by native groups up to and including killing on battlefields. So even the art of war began to change for Native Americans as a result of contact with Europeans. This brings to an end our look at week 8 in the 3190 course.